Coming up in this week's show, we shall be having a look at who your presenters are. We'll be looking at the health advantages of paleo and low carb. And we'll also be having a quick look at what's coming up later on in the series. Hello, it's Mark Moxom here, and I'm joined in the studio today with my co-presenter, Chef Alain Braux, and he's going to introduce himself and tell you a bit about him.
I'm a French-trained professional chef. I started out as a pastry chef, and I started cooking about 20 years ago in my business. Right about 15 years ago, I started being interested in nutrition. And progressively, I started to shift away from purely cooking in the kitchen to more and more nutrition-related, menu creation, writing, advising clients, and so on. So I'm now considering myself more of a nutritionist than a chef, but I also use my background as a chef as a point of experience for what I'm doing with my clients when I advise them.
So most of you will probably know a fair bit about me, as I'm a fairly public face in the low-carb mag arena. I started out years ago as a big fatty and used low-carb to lose a lot of weight, get my health back. And I had to make sure I did that before I got to the age of 40, simply because my grandfather had a heart attack, my father had a heart attack, and my brother had a heart attack, and I thought, I don't want one of those. That's one of the reasons I decided to lose weight. And once I discovered low carb, there was no turning back. However, the traditional low carb diets didn't exactly work for me straight off the bat. I had to test and tweak until I got something that worked exactly right for me. That's because we're all so different. Over the years, I've done many things with low carb. The last one of which is Start Low Carb Mag, which, as you may know, you can now get free both on iTunes and for PCs and Android and everything else. Just go to freelowcarb.com. So that's a bit about us, Alan. Let's carry on now to what we were going to talk about in the main part of the program, and that's the health advantages of paleo and low carb. Now, do you want to start on your side with paleo?
Well, from my personal experience, I had been progressively over the years as I've learned more and more about nutrition, I have progressively moved more and more away from any source of processed carbohydrates, grains, and kind of processed foods in general. And I first started to go back to my original diet, which was the Mediterranean diet, which is healthier than the standard American diet, also called the SAD diet, SAD, Standard American Diet, SAD diet, which really describes what it is. But going back to me, I went back to when I started to realize the effect of the American diet on my body, then I realized I had to go back to the Mediterranean diet in order to control my cholesterol levels and other health issues that were starting to pop up, and that's how I started writing and wrote my first book on how to lower cholesterol with French gourmet food, which sounds a little strange on the face of it, but when you think about it, Mediterranean diet in its original form was mostly about eating fish, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, little bit of grains because there was still the French bread and the baguettes and all these good things and croissants, but not as much as the American diet would give you. And because our region in the south of France, we cannot grow anything like wheat. So wheat is not really part of the general food picture of the southern part of France. Now, granted, obviously, we get products shipped, but I'm referring to the original Mediterranean diet, the way they would eat maybe 100 years ago, with no or limited access to outside sources of dairy and grains, for example. So people in those days lived off what was available locally, which was mostly fishing. So we had very little dairy action going on. The only kind of dairy we would get would be from goat, so goat milk, goat cheese. But that was about the extent of it. The main source of protein was fish, anything that came out of the sea, because there was not a whole lot of cow raising in that area, since it's not. So if we had, of course, chickens, we had access to chickens. Lamb would be a special meal once or twice a year. And then goat, unlike Latin American country, goat is not a meat we eat in the south of France. It's an animal we raise for cheese or milk, but not for the meat. So, but lamb is one. Lamb is one that is,
yum.
A healthy kind of meat, because it only grazes on grass. So it's the original grass-fed meat. But we didn't, I'm talking about my ancestors, didn't have access to cows the way they do now, cow meat. And so that, plus the fact that typically when it gets hot, you tend to eat more salads and, vegetable dishes, nuts. Olive oil is healthier than dairy fat. All of these would tend to make it a much healthier diet than a typical Western diet. Or I don't want to, put the finger on the American diet, but Western diet in general, which typically describes processed foods in general.
Yeah.
And then from that on, once I cleaned up my act with the Mediterranean diet, then I moved on. I realized through my contacts with my clients that there was an issue with gluten. So I started to help people, and then I decided to write a book on gluten-free, dairy-free, because it's almost coming to an epidemic in America to where gluten allergies and dairy allergies are a problem, and especially with kids. So I wrote my gluten-free book, and I started to apply the same principles and started to eliminate gluten, because I got tested and I found I was slightly allergic to gluten. So that was another step forward in cleaning up my act, diet-wise. But because I'm a chef and a French, I still wanted to make sure the food that we ate was not only healthy but also tasty. And I think that's a very important point in the fact that what's the point of being a diet if the food you eat is, is inedible? So my focus as a chef and a nutritionist was always to offer my clients and in my books recipes that were not only gluten-free and dairy-free, but also yummy and tasty and something you actually want to eat. And then moving one step further, then I realized that, maybe grains is not that good anymore. And I started to be aware of the paleo diet, and I started, looking into it, digging into it, and it just completely made sense to me. Eliminate grains and beans and pulses above and beyond everything else already took out. It's like, I get it. It makes sense. And that's when I decided to apply it to myself, to my own diet, and then to write the next book, the Paleo French Cuisine, which applies those principles, but also while using tasty recipes.
To come back to the question a bit more then, so the health advantages from what I've understood on the paleo diet are that it's gluten-free, it's more or less dairy-free, it's tasty, yes, particularly with your French influence.
Tasty.
Grain-free.
Grain-free, pulse-free. The hardcore would go dairy-free as well, which I'm not quite agreeing with them, but that's a personal. Each, as every diet, there's a slight differences depending on who you're talking to. Every paleo guru has a slightly different take on it. Yeah. The hardcore is healthy proteins, healthy, good quality fruits and vegetable, and that's it. That's just the basic. And then eliminate all grains, eliminate all pulses and beans, and eliminate dairy.
Okay.
And that's a simple version of it.
In many ways, I find there is so much in common with the paleo and low carb diet. It's
right.
It's very difficult to draw a line between the two. The great thing I like about both diets is that they both concentrate really nowadays on good, healthy, naturally raised food.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. And I think that's an important point that is not always addressed in some of the paleo books or articles that I read, is that there's not enough focus on the quality of the food. It's just eat this, but there's no explanation at what quality, because you could be following a strict paleo diet and you will still be eating bad food in the sense that it would be loaded with chemicals. It would be fed with genetically engineered grains instead of being grass-fed. It would be sprayed with Roundup or glyphosate, which is dangerous to our body. So I went a step further and I describe how the quality of the food is almost as important as the diet that you follow.
Haven't you got a couple of chapters about that in one of your books?
Yes, I definitely address that issue in my books. All my recommendations are based on the quality of the food and not just the type of food.
I mean, coming back a little bit to low carb, the biggest difference I find between paleo and low carb, and it's not something that we're unable to overcome, is on the paleo diet, there's a more relaxed attitude towards fruit and that sort of thing. Would you say that's generally true?
That's true, yes. Personally, I haven't set any kind of restriction on higher sugar content, fruits versus low sugar content. It does make sense if you have a tendency to be diabetic. I would definitely be cautious about the fructose content of the fruits, so avoid the fruits that tend to increase your blood sugar level or influence that.
Yeah.
But if you're not diabetic, personally, I prefer to focus on the health quality of the fruit and not the sugar content.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. I'd rather you eat a banana than a cookie.
Oh, God, yeah.
Right. Even though, well, if you're diabetic, then I would suggest, don't eat the banana because it is, high in fructose, but instead switch to a lower calorie fruit like an orange or maybe a kiwi or maybe avoid grapes because they tend to be very sugary, and then just focus on the lower calorie fruits. So that would be a main difference, yes. So I take that into account when I help a client. If there's an issue of diabetes on top of other issues, then I would definitely focus on the sugar content of the fruit versus just the fruit itself.
So those are the main, from our point of view, those are the main health advantages of both the paleo and the low carb ways of eating. That's really, I think, nicely answered our question for today. So let's have a quick look at what's coming up in the rest of the series. We'll be looking at things you can use right now in your low carb and paleo way of eating and living. We'll also answer your most pressing questions. And if you've got a question, by the way, please send it in to question@lowcarbmag.com. We'll also be looking at the hot trends in paleo and low carb. And we'll be advising you on the things, products and services that you should avoid, probably at all costs. So there you have it. That's all from Chef Alain and myself, Mark Moxom. Don't forget you can get more from us next week on the Low Carb Paleo Show. And you can find out all about it on Facebook. Simply go to lowcarbpaleoshow.com, and that'll take you straight through to the page. Thanks for listening.